Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. When was the last time you read the fine print on a medication bottle without struggling? Not holding it farther away, not turning on a brighter light, not asking someone else to read it for you, just picking it up and reading it the way you could 10 or 15 years ago. Most people over 60 pause when I ask that question, and that pause matters, because it usually means something has changed. Maybe you've noticed restaurant menus are harder to read than they used to be. Maybe street signs seem a little less sharp. Maybe the headlights from oncoming cars create halos at night that weren't there a few years ago. Or maybe you found yourself updating your glasses more often than ever before. Most people assume they already know the reason. I'm getting older, and certainly, age plays a role. But after spending years studying how vision changes later in life, I've become convinced that many people are looking in the wrong place for answers. The conversation usually begins with the eyes, the prescription, the glasses, the cataracts, the retina. But what if the story starts somewhere else entirely? What if your eyes are simply showing the result of a process that began years earlier in another part of the body? That possibility deserves more attention than it gets, because some of the most important changes affecting vision don't start in the eye itself. They begin in the environment surrounding every cell in your body, the environment your eyes depend on every second of every day. Your bloodstream. That's the part almost nobody talks about. When people notice their vision changing, they naturally focus on what they can see. The blur, the glare, the difficulty reading small print. But very few stop to ask why those changes appeared in the first place. Instead, the prescription gets stronger, then stronger again. And eventually, many people come to believe that declining vision is simply an unavoidable part of growing older. The truth is more complicated, because the tissues responsible for vision are among the most active tissues in the entire human body. Every waking moment they are consuming energy, processing light, sending signals, building images, helping you recognize faces, read words, drive safely, and move through the world. That level of activity requires an enormous amount of support, and when that support system begins to struggle, the eyes often notice before the rest of the body does. What makes this especially important is that the process is usually silent. No pain, no warning, no dramatic symptom announcing that something is changing. Just small shifts that happen so gradually, most people don't recognize them until years have passed. Before we go any further though, I need to make something very clear. Not every vision problem belongs in a conversation like this. If you've experienced a sudden loss of vision in one eye, if you're suddenly seeing flashes of light that weren't there before, if a large number of new floaters appeared out of nowhere, or if it feels as though a dark curtain is moving across part of your vision, don't wait. Those symptoms require immediate medical attention. They can signal a serious eye emergency that needs prompt evaluation. What we're talking about today is different. We're talking about the slow changes, the kind that develop over months, sometimes years, the kind that make you wonder why your eyesight seems different, even though nobody has given you a satisfying explanation. Because once you understand what's happening beneath the surface, many of the changes you've been noticing begin to make a lot more sense. And it starts with something most people experience, but almost nobody pays attention to. The fact that their vision isn't always the same from one part of the day to the next. Think about yesterday for a moment. Was your vision exactly the same at 8 o'clock in the morning as it was at 4 o'clock in the afternoon? For many people, the answer is no. The difference may be subtle, a little more blur later in the day, a little more difficulty reading small print, a little more glare around lights after dinner. Most people never connect those changes to anything specific. They assume they're tired, they assume the lighting is different, or they assume it's just another sign of aging. But there may be something else happening. One of the most overlooked clues in eye health is that vision can fluctuate throughout the day. Not dramatically, not enough to make you panic, just enough that some moments feel clearer than others. The reason that matters is because truly permanent damage doesn't usually behave that way. If your vision becomes noticeably worse after certain meals and noticeably sharper at other times, your eyes may be responding to changes happening elsewhere in the body. To understand why, imagine the lens inside your eye. Its job is remarkably simple. Take incoming light and focus it precisely where it needs to go. When the lens maintains its shape, images stay sharp. When that shape changes, even slightly, vision changes too. What surprises many people is that the lens doesn't have its own direct blood supply. It survives by drawing nutrients from the fluid that surrounds it, and that fluid is constantly influenced by what's happening in your bloodstream, which means the chemical environment around the lens is never completely separate from the rest of your body. After a meal, especially one heavy in refined carbohydrates and sugars, blood glucose naturally rises. That rise is normal. The problem isn't that glucose increases. The problem is how high it goes and how often it happens. When those spikes become frequent, the environment around the lens begins to change. Water movement inside the lens changes. Its shape can temporarily shift, and when its shape shifts, light no longer lands exactly where it's supposed to. The result is often a blur that seems to come and go without explanation. I've spoken with people who spent years believing they needed stronger glasses every time this happened. Yet when they started paying attention, they noticed something interesting. Their clearest vision often occurred first thing in the morning, before breakfast, before snacks, before the day had a chance to unfold. Then, as meals accumulated, the blur gradually returned. Not every day, not every meal, but often enough to reveal a pattern. And patterns matter, because patterns tell us that something is influencing the system. The challenge is that most eye appointments aren't designed to look for those patterns. Your eye doctor checks how clearly you can see letters on a chart. They evaluate the health of the eye itself. Both of those things are important, but nobody usually asks what you ate for lunch. Nobody asks whether your vision changes an hour after dinner. Nobody asks whether your blur is strongest after certain foods and weakest after others. As a result, many people spend years noticing clues without realizing they're clues. What concerns me is not the occasional blur. What concerns me is what repeated metabolic stress can do over time. Because the lens is only the beginning of the story. Far more important is what happens in the tiny blood vessels that keep the retina alive. And that's where the conversation becomes much more serious. The retina doesn't get nearly as much attention as it deserves. Most people think about their eyesight in terms of glasses, maybe cataracts, maybe reading difficulty. But very few think about the tissue that's actually responsible for turning light into the images they see every day. That's the retina, a paper-thin layer of cells lining the back of the eye. And despite how thin it is, it's one of the most metabolically demanding tissues in the entire human body. It never stops working. From the moment you wake up until the moment you fall asleep, those retinal cells are constantly converting light into electrical signals that travel to your brain. Every face you recognize, every road sign you read, every photograph you enjoy, every word on this screen, it all depends on the retina doing its job. The remarkable thing is how that tissue stays alive. It relies on an incredibly delicate network of microscopic blood vessels, not large arteries, not major veins, tiny capillaries, the smallest blood vessels in your body. Some are so narrow that red blood cells move through them almost one at a time. That level of precision is extraordinary, but it also creates vulnerability. Because when the environment inside the bloodstream becomes less healthy, these tiny vessels often feel the effects first. Most people assume serious retinal damage only begins after someone receives a diabetes diagnosis. Unfortunately, biology doesn't work according to diagnostic labels. The body doesn't wait for a doctor to officially give something a name. Changes can begin years before a diagnosis ever appears in a medical chart. That's what makes this so important. Every day, your blood vessels are exposed to the environment created by your meals, your activity level, your sleep habits, and your overall metabolic health. When blood sugar remains elevated more often than it should, a slow process begins affecting tissues throughout the body. One of those tissues is the retina. At first, nothing feels different. No pain, no warning, no dramatic symptom. That's why so many people miss it. The damage develops quietly, month after month, year after year, long before anyone notices a problem. I've seen people who were convinced their vision changes came completely out of nowhere. Then we looked closer, not at their eye chart, not at their prescription, at their daily patterns. The afternoon fatigue, the large carbohydrate-heavy meals, the constant snacking, the lack of movement after eating, and suddenly a different picture emerged. The eyes weren't creating the problem, the eyes were reporting it. That's an important distinction, because if your eyes are reporting what is happening elsewhere in the body, then focusing only on the symptom can cause you to miss the bigger story. And nowhere is that story more important than in the center of the retina itself. a small area responsible for your sharpest vision. The part that lets you read fine print, recognize faces instantly, and see details clearly. Protecting that area becomes increasingly important after 60, because once it begins to struggle, everyday tasks start becoming much harder than they should be. And the surprising thing is that one of its most important defense systems comes directly from the foods you eat every day. Most people have heard the term macular degeneration. Far fewer understand what the macula actually does. And that's unfortunate, because this tiny area of the retina is responsible for some of the most important moments in your day. Reading a text message, recognizing your spouse across a crowded room, seeing the expression on your grandchild's face, threading a needle, reading a restaurant menu. The macula handles detail. Without it, the world may still be visible, but it becomes much harder to see clearly. What makes the macula fascinating is that it comes equipped with its own built-in protection system. Two natural pigments, lutein and zeaxanthin, are concentrated there in unusually high amounts. You can think of them as the retina's personal bodyguards. Every day your eyes are exposed to light, sunlight, television screens, phones, tablets, computer monitors, even ordinary indoor lighting. That exposure creates stress inside retinal tissue. Lutein and zeaxanthin help absorb part of that stress before it reaches the delicate cells responsible for vision. They're working constantly. Most people never notice them. Most people have never even heard of them. Yet they play a critical role in protecting the very tissue that allows you to see detail. The problem is that those protective reserves don't last forever. They have to be replaced. And this is where many adults unknowingly run into trouble. As eating habits change over the years, foods rich in these protective compounds often disappear from the plate. Dark leafy greens become less common. Nutrient-dense foods are replaced by convenience foods. Processed carbohydrates begin showing up more frequently than vegetables. Slowly, without realizing it, people start supplying less of what the retina needs to defend itself. At the same time, another process may be increasing the demand. When blood sugar remains elevated more often than it should, oxidative stress increases throughout the body. The retina is particularly sensitive to that stress. It's consuming large amounts of oxygen every minute of the day, and whenever oxidative stress rises, those protective pigments are called into action. In simple terms, the retina begins spending its defenses faster than it's replacing them. That's not a good long-term strategy. Imagine trying to run a household by constantly spending money and never replacing it. Eventually, the account runs low. The same principle applies here. Protection is being used faster than it's being replenished. And over time, that imbalance can matter. One woman I spoke with in her 70s described it perfectly. She said she could still see. Nothing had gone completely dark, but colors didn't seem as vibrant as they once had. Fine details required more effort. Reading felt more tiring. What stood out wasn't her prescription, it was her lifestyle. Very few vegetables, almost no foods rich in lutein, little dietary variety, and almost no attention paid to the nutritional side of eye health. Like many people, she had spent years assuming vision was something that happened to her rather than something influenced by the choices she made every day. That realization changed how she looked at her health. Because the eyes aren't isolated from the rest of the body, they respond to the same environment affecting everything else. And that brings us to a connection most people never expect. A connection between vision and an organ that seems completely unrelated: your kidneys. At first glance, the two couldn't appear more different. One helps you see, the other helps filter waste. Yet the health of one often tells us far more about the health of the other than most people realize. The connection between the eyes and the kidneys sounds strange at first. Most people never put those two organs in the same conversation, but the longer you study how the body works, the harder it becomes to separate them. Both rely on networks of extremely small blood vessels. Both are highly sensitive to changes in blood sugar, and both can show signs of stress long before a person feels anything is wrong. That's why physicians often pay close attention to kidney health when evaluating long-term metabolic health. The kidneys are remarkably good at compensating. They can lose a significant amount of function before symptoms become obvious. The eyes behave in a surprisingly similar way. Vision may appear relatively normal, while important changes are already developing beneath the surface. This is one reason so many people are caught off guard. They assume that if they can still see reasonably well, everything must be fine. Unfortunately, the body doesn't always give warnings that are easy to recognize. What often begins as a metabolic problem gradually becomes a circulation problem. The tiny vessels throughout the body become less efficient. The kidneys feel it. The retina feels it. And eventually the pressure inside these delicate systems begins to change. When people hear the word pressure, they usually think about blood pressure. What many don't realize is that pressure inside the eye matters too. The eye isn't just an empty space. It contains fluid that must remain carefully balanced. Too little pressure creates problems. Too much pressure creates different ones. Over time, elevated pressure inside the eye can place stress on the optic nerve. The optic nerve is not part of your lens. It's not part of your retina. It's the cable connecting the eye to the brain. Every image you see travels through it. Every visual signal depends on it. When that nerve becomes damaged, vision can slowly begin to disappear. The frightening part is how quietly it can happen. Many people don't notice the early stages. There is often no pain, no dramatic warning, no obvious event that forces someone to seek help. Instead, small portions of peripheral vision begin slipping away, so gradually that the brain adapts and compensates. Months pass, years pass, and by the time the problem becomes noticeable, meaningful damage may already have occurred. This is why I always encourage people to stop thinking about eye health as an isolated topic. The eyes are deeply connected to everything happening elsewhere in the body. Your circulation, your blood sugar, your inflammation levels, your metabolic health, they all leave fingerprints inside the eye. A few years ago, I spoke with a retired teacher who had been updating her glasses regularly for years. Every visit followed the same pattern: a slightly stronger prescription, a brief period of improvement, then a gradual return of the same complaints. Blurry vision in the afternoon, difficulty driving at night, halos around lights. She wasn't diabetic, at least not according to the labels in her medical chart. Her routine blood work rarely raised concern, and yet something clearly wasn't adding up. What happened next completely changed the way she thought about her eyesight. Because for the first time, someone stopped looking only at her eyes and started looking at the patterns shaping her vision every single day. For years, Margaret believed her eyesight was simply following the normal path of aging. She wasn't ignoring her health. She went to her appointments. She had regular eye exams. She updated her glasses whenever she was told she needed a stronger prescription. She did everything she thought she was supposed to do. Yet something never felt quite right. The strange part was that her vision wasn't consistently bad. Some days were better than others. Some mornings she could read comfortably with very little difficulty. By late afternoon, the same page looked different. The words seemed softer, less defined. Driving at night became increasingly frustrating. Headlights produced halos. Street signs were harder to read. And every new prescription seemed to help for a few months before the same problems slowly returned. What finally caught her attention wasn't an eye exam. It was a simple observation. She noticed that the blur was often worst after certain meals, especially dinners built around large portions of rice, pasta, bread, or dessert. On days when her meals were centered around eggs, fish, vegetables, and healthier fats, her vision seemed noticeably more stable. At first, she dismissed it. Most people would. After all, what does dinner have to do with eyesight? But the pattern kept repeating. Eventually, she became curious enough to pay attention. And once she did, something interesting happened. The connection became impossible to ignore. Her clearest vision almost always appeared before breakfast, before the first meal of the day, before blood sugar had a chance to rise. Then, as the day progressed, the fluctuations returned. Nobody had ever asked her to watch for that pattern. Her eye doctor was focused on her prescription. Her primary care doctor was focused on routine lab work. Neither conversation was wrong. They were simply looking at different pieces of the puzzle. For the first time, Margaret started tracking what happened after meals. Not obsessively, just enough to notice trends, and the trends were surprisingly consistent. Meals that produced larger energy crashes often coincided with blurrier vision. Meals built around protein, healthy fats, and vegetables tended to produce fewer fluctuations. That realization changed her perspective completely. Not because it reversed years of accumulated damage, biology rarely works that way, but because it showed her something important. Her vision wasn't behaving randomly. There was a relationship between what she was experiencing and the environment inside her body. Once she understood that, she stopped asking only, "What is happening to my eyes?" and started asking, "What is happening to the system supporting my eyes?" That's a very different question, and it's the question that brings us to something most people never consider. Because blurry vision isn't always the result of structural damage. Sometimes the problem is functional. Sometimes the eye itself looks relatively normal, while the cells responsible for vision are struggling with something much less obvious, a shortage of the nutrients they need to do their job. And that may be one of the most overlooked pieces of the entire conversation. The eye is often described as a window to the brain. That's not just a poetic expression, it's biologically true. The retina is actually neural tissue, the same basic tissue family that makes up parts of your nervous system, which means the cells responsible for vision have extraordinarily high energy demands. They need a constant supply of nutrients just to maintain normal function. When that supply becomes inadequate, problems begin long before an eye chart reveals them. One nutrient that deserves far more attention than it receives is vitamin B1, also known as thiamine. Most people have heard the name, few understand its role. Every cell in your body uses glucose for energy, but glucose can't be turned into usable energy efficiently without thiamine. It's one of the key nutrients that helps power that entire process. The retina, because of its enormous energy requirements, is particularly dependent on it. When metabolic health begins to deteriorate, thiamine demand often rises. The body is forced to work harder to process the same amount of glucose. Over time, that creates an imbalance. The problem isn't always that someone isn't consuming enough thiamine. Sometimes the issue is that the body is using it faster than it can be replaced. The result can be subtle. Visual processing becomes less efficient. Contrast seems weaker. Details appear less crisp. Nothing dramatic. Just a gradual decline that many people attribute entirely to age. Then there's magnesium, a mineral that quietly participates in hundreds of biochemical reactions every day. Magnesium helps regulate blood sugar. It supports healthy blood vessel function. It plays a role in protecting nervous tissue from excessive stress. And yet, a surprising number of older adults consume far less than they need. The challenge is that magnesium deficiency rarely announces itself. People don't wake up one morning knowing they're low. Instead, they experience the consequences indirectly. Poorer glucose control, greater metabolic stress, less efficient recovery. And because magnesium and blood sugar influence one another, the cycle can reinforce itself. The more unstable blood sugar becomes, the greater the strain on the system. The greater the strain, the more difficult balance becomes. Then we come to zinc, another nutrient that rarely receives attention until it becomes a problem. The retina contains remarkably high concentrations of zinc compared with many other tissues in the body. That's not an accident. Zinc is involved in the biochemical processes that help transform incoming light into the signals your brain recognizes as vision. Without adequate zinc, those processes become less efficient. At the same time, zinc contributes to the antioxidant defenses that help protect retinal cells from damage. The difficulty is that zinc absorption often declines with age. What worked at 40 doesn't always work at 70. And because the decline happens gradually, most people never realize it's occurring. What makes all of this so important is that these nutrients don't operate independently. They work together. Thiamine supports energy production. Magnesium supports metabolic regulation. Zinc supports visual processing and protection. When all three begin falling behind at the same time, the retina feels the effects. And unlike a broken bone or a visible injury, the consequences develop quietly. That's why I don't think of eye health as an eye problem. I think of it as a supply problem, a support problem, a question of whether the tissues responsible for vision are receiving what they need day after day, year after year. The good news is that this is where things become practical. Because unlike aging itself, many of these inputs can be changed. And the changes don't begin with supplements. They begin with food. Simple foods that most people can find in an ordinary grocery store. Foods that support the very systems we've been talking about since the beginning of this conversation. And once you understand how to use them correctly, the entire picture starts coming together. The mistake most people make is assuming they need a complicated solution, a special supplement, an expensive program, a perfect diet. In reality, the biggest changes often come from a handful of simple habits repeated consistently. The first begins with breakfast. Not because breakfast is magical, but because the first meal of the day often determines what happens to blood sugar for the next several hours. Many people start the morning with foods that digest quickly: toast, cereal, pastries, fruit juice, sweetened coffee drinks. The problem isn't that these foods exist. The problem is that they enter an empty system and often create a sharp rise in glucose before the day has barely begun. By mid-morning, energy falls, hunger returns, cravings increase, and the cycle starts all over again. A better approach is surprisingly simple. Give your body protein first. Eggs, plain full-fat yogurt, fish, nuts, foods that provide stability instead of spikes. That doesn't mean carbohydrates are forbidden. It simply means they shouldn't be leading the meal. The goal is to create a calmer metabolic environment from the moment the day begins. And that brings us back to the macula. Remember those protective pigments we talked about earlier? Lutein and zeaxanthin. Most people know leafy greens contain them. What fewer people realize is that eating the greens isn't always enough. Absorption matters. These compounds are fat-soluble. Without dietary fat, a significant portion passes through the digestive system without being absorbed efficiently. That's why a plate of spinach by itself isn't the same as spinach cooked with olive oil. It's why kale eaten alongside eggs works differently than kale eaten alone. The nutrients need a vehicle. The fat provides it. I've met people who spent years eating salads because they thought they were doing everything right, yet they were avoiding healthy fats at the same time. The result was that many of the nutrients they were consuming weren't being utilized as effectively as they could have been. Sometimes the smallest details create the biggest differences. The same principle applies throughout the rest of the day. Most people focus on what they eat. Very few pay attention to the order in which they eat it. Yet that order can influence the body's response more than many realize. Imagine sitting down to dinner: vegetables, protein, rice, bread, dessert. Most people reach for the starch first, then the rest follows. But reversing that sequence can change what happens next. Start with the vegetables, then the protein. Leave the starches and sweets for the end of the meal. The food hasn't changed, the calories haven't changed, but the metabolic response often does. That's one reason this strategy has attracted so much interest in recent years. Because it's practical. No special products, no complicated rules, just a different sequence. And there is one more habit that may be even simpler than all of them. It doesn't require a supplement, it doesn't require a recipe, and it doesn't require a gym membership. All it requires is 10 minutes. 10 minutes that can dramatically change what happens after you eat. A 10-minute walk may not sound impressive. It doesn't feel like a workout. You won't finish drenched in sweat. You won't need special equipment. And because it seems so simple, many people underestimate its impact. That would be a mistake. What happens immediately after a meal is one of the most important periods of the day for metabolic health. As food is digested, glucose enters the bloodstream. The body then has to decide what to do with it. One option is to leave most of that work to insulin. The other is to help the process along. That's where movement comes in. When muscles contract, they begin pulling glucose out of the bloodstream to use as fuel. And remarkably, they can do this even without relying entirely on insulin. That's why a short walk after a meal can have such a meaningful effect. Not because you're burning hundreds of calories, but because you're changing where glucose goes and how quickly it gets there. Think about the difference. One person finishes dinner and spends the next hour sitting on the couch. The other spends 10 minutes walking around the neighborhood before settling down for the evening. The meal may be identical. The calories may be identical. Yet what happens inside the body can be very different. Over time, those differences accumulate. That's what people often forget. Health is rarely determined by a single meal, or a single day, or even a single month. It's usually the result of small patterns repeated over years, and the eyes are constantly recording those patterns. They're like a report card for what's happening beneath the surface. This is why I often tell people not to think about vision as a separate issue. Your eyes are connected to everything: your circulation, your blood sugar, your nutrition, your sleep, your activity level. They're all part of the same story. And when one area improves, the benefits often extend much further than expected. Before we finish, there's one final habit I want to talk about. In my experience, it's also the habit most people get completely backwards. It happens every night. Millions of people do it without thinking, and it may be interfering with one of the most important repair processes taking place inside the retina. The surprising part is that the solution doesn't involve eating something. It involves stopping at the right time, and giving your eyes a chance to do something they've been trying to do all along: repair themselves. Your eyes do most of their repair work while you're asleep, not while you're reading, not while you're driving, not while you're watching television, at night, when the world goes quiet and the demands of the day finally stop. What many people don't realize is that the retina follows a daily renewal cycle. The cells responsible for capturing light are constantly wearing out and being replaced. Every day, tiny structures inside those cells are broken down and rebuilt. It's one of the most remarkable maintenance programs in the human body, and it happens whether you're paying attention to it or not. The problem is that repair requires the right environment. It requires energy, it requires resources, and perhaps most importantly, it requires a period of relative metabolic calm. That's why the timing of your last meal matters far more than most people realize. Many adults finish dinner, snack through the evening, and eat again shortly before bed. A bowl of cereal, a few cookies, ice cream, crackers, something small while watching television. It feels harmless, but from the perspective of your metabolism, the workday isn't over. Instead of entering a recovery period, the body is still busy processing food. Blood sugar rises, insulin remains active, digestion continues, and the quiet window that could have been used for repair becomes crowded with competing demands. That's why one of the simplest changes you can make is also one of the most powerful. Finish eating at least 2.5 to 3 hours before bedtime. Give your body a chance to settle. Give your metabolism time to slow down. And give your eyes the environment they need to perform their nightly maintenance. The remarkable thing is that none of the strategies we've discussed today are extreme. No complicated meal plans, no expensive products, no impossible routines. Just a handful of practical decisions repeated consistently. Start your day with protein. Include foods rich in lutein and zeaxanthin. Eat vegetables and protein before starches. Walk for 10 minutes after meals. Support your body with nutrient-dense foods like eggs, leafy greens, fatty fish, and pumpkin seeds. And stop eating a few hours before sleep. Simple doesn't mean insignificant. In fact, the habits that change health most profoundly are often the ones that look almost too simple to matter. Before we finish, I want you to remember something important. Your prescription is measuring how clearly you can see. It is not measuring why your vision changed. Those are two different questions. A stronger lens may improve the symptom, but understanding the environment that created the symptom gives you something far more valuable: perspective. Because your eyes are not isolated from the rest of your body, they are responding to it every single day. The food you eat, the way you move, the way you sleep, the metabolic environment you create from morning until night, all of it leaves a mark. And that's really the message I hope you take away from this conversation. Your eyes are not the beginning of the story, they're often the final chapter, the visible result of choices, habits, and biological patterns that have been unfolding quietly for years. The good news is that those patterns are not fixed, they can change. And sometimes, the first step isn't a new prescription, it's simply learning to see the bigger picture. Now you know where to start.